the United States, we use a measure of poverty called an absolute income test. If your income falls below a certain level, we consider you to be poor. The federal government has its own income threshold for poverty, but some localities also use others, such as New York City, which uses a measure of poverty adjusted for the city's higher cost of living and healthcare debt. Although the federal and New York City government use an absolute income test, some researchers prefer to use a relative income test. With a relative income test, if your income falls at the bottom of the distribution, you would be considered poor. That bottom could be something like 50% below the economy's median income. The difference here is that poverty is defined as it relates to the distribution of income. How poor you are depends on how close you are to the middle. But why would we care to have an absolute income threshold to define poverty? Because it's possible that being poor is about more than where you are on the distribution of income. It might be about what you can actually afford to do with your disposable income. Someone living in a nation where the median income is, say, $1,000 a year is arguably not out of poverty because they make $1,200. Nor is someone necessarily in poverty because they make $70,000 a year in an economy where the median income is $150,000. When you use an absolute income threshold, it's often called a poverty line. We say someone has fallen below the poverty line if their family income is lower than that threshold. The poverty line is almost always different depending upon the size and makeup of your household. The percentage of the population that falls below the poverty line is called the poverty rate. This is why many researchers prefer an absolute income threshold, because it allows for progress to be made on fighting poverty. There will always be people on the bottom third of the income distribution, and it will always be a third of the population. But if the poverty line is a relatively static measure defined as an absolute income your household is either above or below, you can see over time if more or less people are ending up in poverty every year. Do the same kinds of households regularly fall below the poverty line in the United States? This is where social mobility comes into consideration. We know people can move up and down the income spectrum, but do they? Or do some? We know that upward mobility has actually been pretty stagnant since the 1970s, implying that generations of households have remained roughly in the same part of the income spectrum as their parents, or lower. While that's helpful to know, it doesn't entirely tell us if the same kinds of households end up below the poverty line. Researchers tend to find some consistencies among what kind of households are regularly under that poverty line. According with the drivers of income inequality, households headed by unmarried women are disproportionately represented among the poor. This probably has more to do with the stability of a dual earner household than with the sanctity of marriage or anything innately flawed with female heads of households. Poor households tend to have children, lower educational attainments, a college degree is nearly poverty proofing, and are often but not always jobless. In an earlier video, I discussed William Julius Wilson's take on jobless poverty in urban centers and how poverty intersected by joblessness is a fairly recent aspect of American poverty, starting in the 1970s with structural changes to the U.S. economy's demand for labor. Jobless poverty is particularly vicious because of the sociological consequences of being out of work. In addition to the previously discussed traits, the American poor tend to be non-white and live in urban centers. We'll get into why both are true next.